Good morning, everyone, once again, and thank you for joining. I'm Davina Gounden. I'm the Communications Coordinator here at RPRA. And welcome to RPRA's webinar on the proposed 2022 RRCEA program fees consultation. Today's session is one of two where we'll walk through the proposal and have dedicated time to answer your questions. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and that the slides and recording will be available later on this week. And so, as I mentioned, today's webinar will be about answering your questions. To ask a question, you can click on the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen and type in the question or comment and click send. I would like to note that there is an upvote or a like feature where you can like another person's question. You'll see a little thumbs up next to the question once it has been submitted. If you do see a question that maybe you wanted to ask or would really like an answer to, please feel free to like the question. It'll move it higher into our queue. But you will also see that in our presentation, we have a few dedicated slides where we'll stop and answer your questions. And we will try to organize and respond to them in the topics that they coincide in. So if you notice that your question has been asked, but it hasn't been answered yet, it may make sense to ask it in a later or answer it in a later section in the presentation. So please stay tuned for that. I also see that we have quite a few participants in this webinar. So it is possible that we won't get to all the questions during the allotted time. And if we can't get to your question or it's very specific to your situation, we will follow up with you after the webinar. Once again, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to our website along with this presentation later this week. If you miss anything or want to revisit the content, it will be available on our consultation page. And so joining me today on our panelist is Noah Gitterman and Stacy Bowman. And so I'll just hand it over to you, Noah, to kick off today's presentation. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Noah Gitterman. I'm the Chief of Strategic Initiatives here at RRCEA. If you were participating in our fee consultation webinars last year, you'll remember me from those consultations. Davina, why don't we just kick it off and go to the first slide. So we always start with a little bit about who RRCEA is and why we're here. So we're the regulator mandated by the RRCEA to deliver or administer RRCEA programs, and under the WDTA to administer the legacy WDTA programs. And so those two statutes work together to outline a legislative framework that winds up the old waste diversion programs and introduces new producer responsibility programs under the RRCEA. To date, we have all our programs are have wound up or are winding up under the WDTA, tires, batteries, electronics, and MHSW and Blue Box, which is transitioning as well. And we now have 5 or 6 programs now running under the RRCEA, and we're consulting now on fees for all of the RRCEA programs. So tires, batteries and ITT AV, Blue Box, and HSP. RRCEA also has responsibility for delivering registry services under the RRCEA for 2 other programs that aren't resource recovery programs, for excess soil and hazardous waste. The excess soil fees were set at the end of 2021, and the hazardous waste program is still in development. It's not an active program in 2022. So we're not setting fees for hazardous waste in 2022, but we will for 2023. Next slide. So again, just a bit more background to kind of set the scene for everyone. Producers under all of the RRCEA regulations are required to register and report to RRCEA through our registry. For some producers right now, it's a manual or spreadsheet-based process because the registry portal is not yet built. For others, you go straight through our registry portal to register or continue to report your supply on an annual basis. We are what's called an administrative authority. So we are not part of government, although we're created by statute and mandated to administer these programs. So we don't receive any government funding, and all of our operations are funded through the fees we charge to our regulated parties, and it's all on a cost recovery basis. So we have the statutory authority to set and collect fees under both the WDTA and the RRCEA. So the WDTA, we set monthly cost recovery charges to the IFOs and industry stewardship organizations under that statute. So those costs are not part of the consultation we're talking about now. Under the RRCEA, we set fees both for the producer responsibility programs and for these registry service programs under the EPA. So that's excess soil and hazardous waste. So in this consultation, we're just focused on the RRCEA producer responsibility programs. So again, that's tires, batteries, and ITT Blue Box, HSP, and for the first time in 2022, lighting. And in this couple of hours, we're focused on tires, batteries, and ITT and lighting. And then I think tomorrow we will be focused on Blue Box and HSP fees. A lot of the presentation will be the same today and tomorrow, but we'll have a bit more time to focus on the specific fee schedules for the specific programs that we're focusing on today and tomorrow. The RRCEA fees that we're proposing will cover the costs, recover RRCEA's costs to do all the work that we do. That includes developing and operating the registry systems to support the programs, carrying out compliance and enforcement activities, providing support to registrants in complying with their regulatory operations, including, communications and finance support for all of these activities. When we're looking at our registry service programs for excess oil and hazardous waste, it's a lot of the similar, the activities are similar, except without compliance and enforcement. So for excess oil and hazardous waste, the ministry is still responsible for compliance. So those wouldn't be part of the costs we recover through those fees. And again, on the WDTA side, we're recovering our costs to oversee the windup of those programs, essentially. Next slide, please. So we're, just as a reminder again, this is a consultation, so we're proposing on a method for setting fees and a set of fee rates. We'll get into the details of what they are and sort of what the inputs are later on. And so we do want feedback. Again, you'll see on the slide a list of the programs, again, that we're consulting on fees for 2022. And we're also going to talk a little bit about In addition to the fee rates that we're proposing, we're going to talk a little bit about some minor changes to our fee setting policy and some changes to our cost allocation methodology for 2022, which impact the RRCEA programs, the producer responsibility programs that you see listed on this slide. So we're not dealing in this consultation with the WDTA fees, and we're not dealing with excess soil or hazardous waste program fees, those digital reporting service fees during this consultation. Next slide, please. So we thought we'd step back a bit. This may be a new slide for folks that have been part of this process in past years. Just at a very high level to set out sort of how we go about setting our fees. And the starting point is really our general fee setting policy, which is on our website. And that contains a number of principles that we use and that our board uses to guide its approach to fee setting. And then looking to that policy for guidance, there are sort of four main steps to developing the fee proposal that we launched a couple of weeks ago. So the first step is our annual budget. And the annual budget is set out in our business plan, which we are required to publish every fall for the upcoming calendar year. And we do consult on our annual budget with our Industry Advisory Council and our Service Provider Advisory Group. This year it'll be the Service Provider Advisory Council when we consult on the 2023 business plan. For the 2022 business plan, it was approved in fall of 2021 and posted on our website before the holidays. So that's step one, is determining our annual budget. Step two is our cost allocation methodology, and that is what we use to allocate that budget to the different RRCEA, EPA, and WDTA programs that we operate. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that works. Once we have program budgets for each of the programs, we use a fee model that will determine the fee that the obligated parties within each RCA program will be charged. And again, we'll talk a bit more about the fee model, what that fee model is and how it works. And then finally, we have fee model inputs. So for the input to work, so obviously one input is the cost recovery target that is developed through the cost allocation methodology. The other fee model inputs are used to determine the specific fee rate that are paid by producers in each program in order to reach that cost recovery target. And some of the key inputs are the amount of material supplied in each program, and that's because the fee model uses rates based on amount of material supplied. So our estimates of what that amount of material is has a direct impact on the fee rate, the final fee rate. Another input is surplus or deficit from prior years. So once we have all of those things, the budget, the total RIPR budget, the allocated cost recovery budgets for each of the programs, a fee model for how we determine who we will be recovering fees from, and the fee model inputs, then we have our fee rate at the end, which you've seen already online, or which we'll get into as we go through this presentation. So next slide, please. New this year was that RRCEA engaged a third-party consultant to review our fee setting process and identified potential enhancements to make sure what we do reflects best practices in fee setting. We procured Optimus SBR to do the review, and they did a jurisdictional review of some comparator organizations. They looked at our cost allocation methodology, which was step 2 in the previous slide. They looked at our fee model, which was step 3 in the previous slide. And they also assessed our general fee setting policy. As a result of that review, they determined that our fee setting principles set out in our policy were consistent with recognized best practices, although they've suggested some changes to those principles, mostly just to sort of clarify and simplify the wording so they sort of make sense for RRCEA's context. They determined that our cost allocation methodology is reasonable, and that our fee model approach is reasonable. And there's an executive summary of their conclusions on our website. That's linked to on the consultation page on our website. So I don't know if, forget if Davina mentioned this already, but the proposal and some related materials are already posted on the consultation page on our website, and this deck will get posted there too after the presentation. Next slide, please. A little bit about the consultation process. So RRCEA is obligated to consult on the fees that, or the method for setting its fees under our statute. We're required to consult for 45 days. And then the fees need to be posted for 30 days before they can be enforced. We started our consultation on the RRCEA 2022 Producer Responsibility Program fees on March 10th. And so it will end on April 25th. You can send feedback to the email address you see on the slide. You can send questions to the email address you see on the slide. If there are things you don't understand and that I wasn't able to explain during this presentation, obviously there's the 2 webinars. What we do is we take all that feedback and summarize it in a report that is part of the material that our board receives when it makes its final decision on fees for 2022. And we also post our consultation report on our website once the consultation is completed. And then we'll obviously communicate with our stakeholders once the fees are set and once it's time for producers to come in, start reporting their supply to us. And again, all this info is on our website if you need to go back to it. Next slide, please. Okay, so first, thanks, Davina. So maybe we'll just spend a little bit of time on our fee setting policy. So that's the fee setting policy is a public document posted on our website. It was first developed back in 2018 before RRCEA set fees for the first producer responsibility program, which was tires. Again, it sets out really the principles that guides the board in setting fees. We're proposing some changes. They're not really substantive. The changes are really about kind of simplifying and clarifying, making sure that the principles we're using sort of make sense for RRCEA. some of it is reducing redundancy, some of it is about eliminating outdated information, some of it is to make sure that the principles set out in that document aren't overly restrictive, given our expanded mandate since that document was first approved. So, and by that, I mean the fact that we now set fees, not just for producer responsibility programs, but also these registries. And I think there's a table summarizing the changes to the principles. So on the left side of this table is what our current is a list of the current principles in our approved policy on our website. I think they are all, the starting point for these principles is an OECD best practices document on regulatory fee setting. On the right-hand side are our proposed principles. So again, we're not really losing any principles, but we're kind of condensing and restating some of them. I'll maybe leave that here, but I'm happy to answer questions about these during this presentation if you have it. So maybe let's move on, Davina, to, oh, well, here's a good time to stop for questions. So let's stop and maybe see what kinds of questions we have already.
Sure, yeah, we do have some in the queue already. We just have one clarifying question. Are we going to get into the specific types of lighting in this webinar?
That's a good question. I think the short answer is no. So the fee proposal that we've set out is kind of agnostic on the type of lighting. So what it applies to is all of the lighting that's obligated under the lighting regulation. So we're probably not going to get into in this webinar a discussion of what is obligated and what isn't. But if you have questions about that, we definitely want to get those questions because they're important questions to answer. We can make sure that the right people at RRCEA can help you with it.
I also have a question here. What comparator organizations did Optimus use in their review?
So that's a good question. I think Optimus looked at a bunch of different organizations, and I think did a deeper dive looking at Alberta's recycling authority and Ireland's recycling authority. So those were the ones that they sort of did a deeper dive into in terms of sort of looking at what other options there are out there, what other best practices there are out there for developing fee models in this context.
Great. And then we also have another question here is, what is Optimus's definition of reasonable?
That's a good question. I think in their executive summary, I don't think they define reasonable. But I think they're looking at reasonableness in the context of the principles that guide our fee setting, and how other similar organizations do this kind of fee setting, and given sort of RRCEA's kind of unique context and where RRCEA is in its development.
Okay, great. And I do see a bit of questions here about the lighting examples covered. RPRA will be reaching out to lighting producers closer to registration. So we can move on to the next part of the presentation, Noah.
Sure, yeah, let's go to the next slide. So again, remember we were starting with our, actually maybe before I go ahead, just on the, because I did see there were a couple more lighting questions. So again, in this consultation, you're right, we're not describing the scope of the lighting regulation, but it is important that get communicated out. Obviously, you know, part of RRCEA's job in administering these regulations is to make sure that people know who's obligated and who isn't, and what's obligated and what isn't. So we will be communicating about that proactively as we get closer to the deadline for lighting producers to report. But if you have specific questions, I think we'll make sure that we've got an email, some contact information for you, so you can reach out to us and we can answer those questions. Back to the slide in front of us. So we started with our budget. And so what we're looking at in this pie is how that budget is broken down between our producer responsibility programs here, the RRCEA programs, our WDTA programs, and the EPA programs. Those are those digital registry service programs. So total budget recovery is about 17.3 million. The RRCEA cost recovery target is about 12.8 million. There are year over year, the total budget has increased, although to reflect our increasing mandate, although the WDTA program budget has decreased substantially, and the RCEA program budget has increased as well. Some of the EPA program budget is built into deferred costs that will get billed out to those programs in future years. Next slide, please. So there's a more detail. Well, there's a breakdown of kind of the year over year changes in those overall budgets. Again, there's a substantial decrease in the WDTA program side, and then a corresponding increase on the RRCEA program side. If you look at total WDTA and RRCEA fees together, the increase is about 12%, and that's mostly because of how of the new programs we're taking on, particularly lighting. We'll, I think in the next few slides, and we'll see, we'll get into the individual program budgets, and then the program fee schedules. So maybe the next slide, please. So starting with those overall budget numbers, we then need to assign cost recovery targets for each of our RRCEA programs. first part of that is applying forecasted direct expenses to each program. Most of the direct expenses, or the biggest component of those, are registry related costs. And that's the amortization and interest for what we call the foundational registry costs that are assigned to your program and your program's particular portal costs. In terms of the foundational costs, those are split equally across the program. So every program ends up incurring an equal amount of foundational costs, despite when the program kind of came online. But the portal costs will differ depending on what it costs to build that program's particular registry portal. Again, some of the registry portals have been built, some are still in process. So Blue Box and HSP is targeted to get finished this year. All of the others are already built, including lighting. So when the lighting producers come in, you will come in through the lighting portal later this year. So in addition to the direct expenses, we have forecasted indirect costs. So those are RRCEA costs that are shared equally across all the programs that incur them. So some examples are things like website and communications, some IT expenses, some payroll expenses. And then we have what we call shared service expenses. And those are either allocated equally or in proportion to the number of producers or number of registrants in the program. So again, some examples there include additional payroll, like compliance officers, registry support officers. And so those are allocated in proportion to number of producers or number of registrants in the program. Some registry specific IT resources are put into that bucket. And then we have every program contributes to our organizational reserve, which is based on their share of total expenses. And our reserve is capped in our operating agreement with the ministries. So our reserve can be a maximum of 50% of our operating budget. And then there are some startup costs from when RRCEA first came into existence that are recovered equally across all the programs. So we bundle all of that up to get a program cost recovery target for each program. So again, the main components are the indirect and shared costs. For efficiency reasons, RRCEA doesn't, we typically don't have program specific personnel. So if you look at our compliance officers and registry support officers, they work across all the programs, and that's in part because it's more efficient to do it that way. We have programs that have different registration dates, different different reporting dates, sort of a different pace of compliance activity. And so most of the work from our kind of front-facing registry support and compliance team is shared across all of those resources. And so a lot of the program cost is allocated through our either as an indirect or a shared service expense. Direct expenses for each program are mostly made up of registry related costs that are specific to that program's registry portal. Next slide, please. So here's the program breakdown in terms of our cost recovery targets, and we've got all of the RRCEA programs represented on this pie. And again, lighting is a new program this year, so is getting an allocated budget or an allocated cost recovery target for the first time this year. And we'll be setting fees for lighting for the first time this year. Next slide, please. So I think now we'll get into our fee model. So again, that is step 3, going back to that earlier slide. So we talked about the overall budget, talked a bit about our cost allocation methodology. And now we're getting into our 2022 fee model. So we're proposing to use the same fee model in 2022 that we used in 2020 and 2021, which is sort of variable fee rates that are tied to material supply for larger producers, and a flat fee for small producers that are below a de minimis supply threshold. We're proposing to increase the flat fee for small producers from $75 to $100. And that's mostly to reflect that our budget has been increasing over time, and that fee has stayed the same since 2018. The fee model, again, was part of the review process that we went into with Optimus. The reason we have chosen to, part of the reason we've chosen to stick with our 2020, our existing fee model for 2022 is because it's aligned with the objective in the regulations to hold producers responsible for what they supply into the market. It fulfills our equity fee setting principle by protecting small producers from excessive burden. Helps ensure large producers pay fees that reflect the quantity of material they supply, and helps ensure that producers don't have a competitive advantage on a per product basis because of the RRCEA fee, as well as simplicity and predictability. So it's easy, relatively easy for us to set that fee and estimate what our revenues will be over the year, and build it into our registry reporting portal. Next slide, please. So I think there's some details here about the fee model, but I might save most of them for, I might save all of them actually for when we get into the individual fee schedules for each of the programs. Maybe Davina will go to the next slide. We did look at some alternative fee models with the help of Optimus. So one of the options we looked at was a 3-tiered flat fee model for small, medium, and large producers. So getting rid of this what we call variable rate based on kilograms or units, and just looking at a flat fee model that would have 3 tiers of fee. So we're not recommending that or proposing that for this year, part because it would shift substantial costs from larger producers to smaller producers, putting undue burden on those smaller producers, and potentially distorts the playing field, because then unit costs would no longer be the same across competitors in the same material group. We also looked at shifting to per unit fees rather than per kilogram fees across the board, instead of our current approach, which is weight-based or per kilogram fees for all the programs except for tires. And we're not proposing that for 2022, for a large part because a per unit model for programs other than tires really increases the complexity, because there's no common definition for units for our programs with multiple material groups in them, and potentially reduces equity because of problems with defining what a unit is when we have such disparate material groups in one program. The final or the third model, alternative fee model we looked at for 2022 was actually an amalgamated approach, which would have combined all registry RRCEA or producer responsibility program costs together, rather than allocating them program by program, and then recovering them from all producers together. So that's something we want to consider for future fee setting, after we have time to do some additional analysis. We're not proposing it for 2022, in part because there was insufficient time and data for us to analyze its impact on individual producers. It seemed to maybe make more sense when RRCEA is in a bit of a more stable environment. So when we aren't adding new programs every year and we have a better handle on what our what RRCEA looks like as a more stable operating entity. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're getting into the fee rates for the individual programs. So tires, relatively straightforward proposal in terms of the structure. Again, as I explained when talking about the model, we've got a flat fee for small producers and a per tire fee for the larger producers. We're proposing an increase in the rate year over year from 2021. I should note that the base fee per tire would have been just over 15 cents a tire, but because of some surplus carryover from 2021, we're proposing a rate of 14 cents, 14.1 cents. Just as a reminder to the tires folks, the 2021 rate, the 13.5 cents, was actually held steady from 2020 on purpose because we weren't able to do a cost allocation recovery budget in 2021 because of the timing of fee setting and the fact that we didn't have all of our regs in place for 2021 until much later in the year. So as an alternative last year, we just held the rate steady from 2020 to 2021. But now we're doing a full allocation. And so the rate is changing, and we're back up to about 14 cents per tire. I think our estimates, so again, a key input here is our estimates about the volume of tires that we think are going to get reported in 2022. And I think that's unchanged from last year, with about, we expect about 13 million tires to get reported as part of the 2022 reporting process. And so I think I should, I guess, clarify. So I think that 13 million number would then be an average of the 2018, 2019, and 2020 reporting. So it's a rolling average that gets wrapped up into the supply amount for invoicing fees. Maybe move to the next slide. Okay, so this is the ITTAV and batteries proposal. So the fee structure is unchanged from 2021. Just like in 2020 and 2021, when fees were paid, the cost recovery targets, we're proposing that the cost recovery targets for ITTAV and batteries are merged. You'll see the small producer fee, again, it's $100. That's the same across all the programs, and is up from $75. And the per kilogram fee is just under 6 cents a kilogram. So that fee is about a 48% increase from the 2021 rate, which was 4 cents a kilogram. Again, the 2021 rate, we had held steady from 2020 without doing a program budget allocation for the same reasons we did in tires. We didn't have all our regs in place. We couldn't allocate our full budget, so we just held over the 2020 fees for 2021. And now we're doing a full allocation and setting the fee to match up revenues with our cost recovery target. Most of the reason for that increase is because of two things. One is we're estimating much lower ITTAV supply volume than we did back in 2020 when we first set rates. And there's a deficit carryover from 2021 that we're proposing to collect from ITTAV in 2022. And that deficit is again due to the fact that the supply that got reported to us was less than what we had predicted. And so now we need to sort of true it up or make up the difference from last year. The 2022 base fee without accounting for the deficit would have been about 5 cents per kilogram. And I guess sort of consistent with what I just said about the impact of lower volumes and the deficit. If we were using the same volume estimates we used back in 2020, and we didn't have a deficit carryover, the 2022 rate would actually have been a bit lower than it was back in 2020. You can see our volume estimates on the bottom right hand of the page in terms of the supply amounts that we expect to get reported in 2022. Next slide, please. And the last program for today is lighting. We have, again, a $100 flat fee for small lighting producers. There's the threshold we chose there is aligned with small and large producer distinction set out in the regulation. The relatively higher per kilogram rate there compared to the ITTAV fee essentially reflects the weight of material that's getting reported or is obligated under the regulation. And it's a lighter weight material. The volume estimates we're using are an average. So again, under the reg, it's an average of volume supplied in 2018, 2019, and 2020. But the estimates we're using are based on supply volume that was reported in the BC market under the BC Producer Responsibility Regulation, which has covers roughly the same kinds of material that the Ontario regulation covers, but adjusting for population and program, adjusting for population differences and some program differences in Ontario. So you can see our estimates there about the amount of material that's going to get reported. We very much appreciate input into those estimates. If stakeholders think we're either under or overestimating what will get the amount of material that will get reported or the number of producers, that helps us better match the fee rate to our cost recovery target. So obviously very closely linked. So again, we have our fee model, which sets out a flat fee and for small producers and a per kilogram fee for larger ones. But a key input into that model, that last step in the process, is estimates around volume. So the more information we have about that, the better. With new programs, it's hard to have very good information until we're operating for a couple of years and can do the compliance work to verify things. But feedback on that is much appreciated. Next slide, please. Oh, so we do have a couple slides on Blue Box and HSP, I think. Here's the Blue Box fee. Again, I think this won't spend a lot of time here because I don't think we have Blue Box folks on the call. I will be focusing on it tomorrow. But same structure as the other programs, and the Blue Box fee rate is also increasing, although I don't recall exactly what the percentage is. And here are the fees for the fee schedule for HSP. HSP is a bit more complicated. I won't spend a ton of time on it because we're going to be talking about it tomorrow. It's a bit more complicated because there are some additional categories of material that are regulated in a very different way from the other programs. And in particular, they don't require annual supply reporting, but the regulatory burden on those programs is a lot less. So those fees are dealt with very differently, with just a one flat fee for all of the producers in those programs. That's the category C, D, and E. But categories A and B are treated like our other producer responsibility programs, $100 flat fee, and then that per kilogram rate for the larger producers, which I think is up from 1.3 cents to 1.5 cents this year. Next slide, please. So now we're at questions.
We have a few more questions that have come in. So we have a question here that says, have you looked at simplifying the fees by having a single flat fee per registrant?
So we did look at that as part of our work with Optimus. It was actually sort of, I mentioned we looked at a 3-tiered flat fee. We did also look at a single tiered flat fee. It was, we're not proposing that approach essentially for the same reasons that we're not proposing the three-tiered approach, that it transfers a lot of the fee burden onto medium producers or smaller producers, and the 3-tiered approach was actually a way for us to try to sort of manage that. But even with splitting out one fee into 3 fees, we still saw kind of an excessive amount of fee burden shifting onto medium producers where fees would have been increasing for those producers by orders of magnitude. It's really for that reason that we aren't proposing to go ahead with it in 2022. Again, we're still setting fees each year because we're still getting new programs every year. So next year we're going to have hazardous waste program up and running and charging fees to those registrants for the first time. So we're going to be looking at this again later this year. But for now, we didn't think the sort of the single flat fee or the three-tiered flat fee approach was justified.
Great, thank you, Noah. We have another question here. It says lighting is going to increase RPRA's cost by 12%. Does RPRA disclose the breakdown of this cost?
So I don't think in this presentation we have the breakdown. So so what we've talked about now is we've talked about in this presentation sort of the breakdown of the overall budget into the different programs. I don't think we have in this presentation a breakdown of sort of what are the direct, indirect, and shared costs, cost recovery targets for each of the programs. But if that's something you are interested in, I think we can get that information for you. For lighting, because it's a new, actually, no, I was going to say for lighting, because it's a new program, there probably won't be a lot of direct expenses related to the registry, but actually the lighting registry is already built because we were able to do it as part of a registry project last year with batteries and ITT AV. So there is a direct registry cost component plus the indirect and shared. So I think we'd be able to provide you, follow up and provide you that detail.
Thank you. And if a producer needs to finance the operating cost of RPRA, what is the incentive for producers to strive for a circular economy and waste reduction? They give an example, the fee per kilogram would go up if the total amount of waste would go down.
So, so if I'm understanding that question right, I think the answer might be that, well, the incentive, if you're supplying less weight to begin with into the province, your RRCEA fee will go down. Which is but I don't think the RRCEA fee is particularly geared to, like, it's not based on the amount of waste that gets recovered, and in part because that's not information that we have in advance for each program. We do set up that fee to try to account for the regulatory objective to make producers responsible for what they are supplying into the province, for the amount of material they're supplying into the province. And that's partly where it comes from. We also use this per kilogram fee because it's equitable among producers in the same category. So from the perspective of RRCEA's costs, producers will sort of face the same per unit price. But the real incentive, I guess, for producers out of this program is that if they can do better on resource recovery and waste reduction, their total resource recovery costs will go down. So again, the RRCEA fee is kind of a small component of the overall program cost for these programs, because in addition to paying RRCEA, producers need to pay for the recovery of what they collect and are obligated to manage. And so I think that's sort of where the real incentive for resource recovery, efficiency, and waste reduction comes from, is the bulk of those program fees are really not from RRCEA, but up to the producer to manage within the constraints of the regulation. I don't know if that, hopefully that's a helpful answer.
Thank you, Noah. We have a question here that says, can you share the RRCEA budget broken down by material group? We have in this presentation, and if it's not on our website yet, it will be when we post this presentation, the breakdown for each, like in terms of the cost recovery target for each of the programs. We don't further break it down in terms of the material groups in each of those programs. So if you're thinking about HSP, for example, we don't have a breakdown of the different of that allocation for each of the material groups that are obligated under that program. We only do the allocation at the cost recovery at the program level. We don't do a further allocation. So all of the producers, for example, in HSP, share in that program's cost. So hopefully that answers the question. Okay. But if not, you can ask it again. And what is RPRA's estimate on non-registered producers who are not contributing to program costs?
So I think that's really, that really sounds like a compliance question. So a key focus of the work we do is to make sure that everyone who's obligated to register and report is registering, reporting. We're very focused on making sure we're catching free riders and making sure they're contributing. It's a key part of what RRCEA is here for, and we know it's a key expectation of producers who are paying the fees. We typically take a risk-based approach to the compliance work we do. And so obviously when we're looking at free riders, we're focused on those who are bigger producers or more substantial producers, or who we expect might be, because that will have a bigger environmental impact, but will also have a bigger impact in terms of equity with compliant producers. So that's sort of, that's a little bit about sort of our approach and how important free riders are to us. We don't, it's a hard question to answer specifically, because we don't know what we can't know what we can't know. We do have ongoing compliance activities across all of the active programs to make sure that free riders are coming into the system. We're catching free riders throughout the year. When we do get free riders in, though, typically they will be required to catch up with reporting that they failed to do in the past. So at the end of the day, that will go into the pot and then help reduce fees for others. We have the government is currently consulting on an administrative penalty reg that would bring into force some aspects of the statute that would allow RRCEA to assess monetary penalties on non-compliant entities, including producers, that would help encourage them to comply, but would also allow us to sort of extract whatever economic benefit they gain from failing to comply in past years. We could assess a penalty to recover that. And again, that would go into offsetting once those producers become compliant, that kind of penalty, if that regulation gets approved and we get that power gets turned on, would come into RRCEA to help offset the costs for compliant producers.
Great, thank you, Noah. We have a clarification question here. Are weights reported for fees inclusive of weights used as deductions for reuse and recycled content?
So I'm gonna give an answer, but then I'm maybe gonna ask our team to just confirm it. So I'm pretty sure that the weights that what we're proposing, which is the same as the proposal in 2020 and 2021, is that it's the weight that we use to set fees includes the reductions that are allowed in the reg. So I don't know if it was noted in any of the fine print in the fee schedule, but and I just got a confirmation from one of my colleagues that that's correct. So just like 2020 and 2021, the rate we set the fee on is the weight we set the fee on is the weight minus the reductions that you're allowed for, and that applies to batteries, ITT.
Perfect. And we have another compliance related question here. What current efforts is RPRA implementing to ensure all producers are registered and contributing to program costs?
So we have a compliance department and a whole compliance team that is focused on implementing a risk-based approach to compliance and enforcement to make sure that producers are getting registered and are contributing. We combine that with a communications team that helps support the compliance folks to make sure we're reaching out and finding the entities that need to comply, and making sure they understand what their obligations are, and are brought into compliance. So that's part of the reason that RRCEA's budget, RRCEA budget, is growing between last year and this year, is to make sure we have enough resources to support that important activity. If you've interacted with our compliance team or been involved in any webinars that our registrar has led, you'll know that we put a big focus up front, especially when programs are new, on communicating for compliance, or C4C. So it's a lot of communications work, a lot of one-on-one conversations between registry officers and potential producers to make sure they understand what their obligations are and when they need to fulfill them by. It's a big part of what we do and why we're here. I should add that in addition to making sure that producers are in the system, another big piece of our compliance work is making sure that what they're reporting is accurate. Once the reports come in, there's verification work that RRCEA has to do. Sometimes there's verification work that the producers are obligated to do on their own under the regulation to support the reports, the validity of the reports we're getting in. So that's another big important piece to make sure we've got the right data, which is important for fees, but also important for overall regulatory outcomes of these programs.
Awesome, thank you. We have a comment, and Noah, if you could share any insight into it. So could you please consider having a simplified process of a single flat fee per registrant who may be subject to more than one program?
Yeah, we've considered that, and we've been asked about that in the past. I think, again, sort of for similar reasons why we've rejected the flat fee approach on a program by program basis. We aren't proposing that for this year. Putting sort of the flat fee idea aside, part of the reason we don't have sort of just a single invoice for someone who's in multiple programs is that the programs all have different reporting timelines right now, and we have an allocation approach that has cost recovery targets on a program by program basis. Sort of part of the reason for that program by program allocation is to make sure that each program is paying for its share. It's possible if we went to, so I talked earlier about an amalgamated approach where we aren't allocating to different programs, but we have sort of a single RRCEA bucket, and we're applying program fees across to producers in all the RCEA programs in the same way without allocation. And maybe that kind of approach would allow for sort of a single fee per registrant across programs. But that's something we're proposing to look at in the future. We're not quite ready for that in 2022. Again, when we're growing and adding on new programs and from year to year, it's without sort of the data we get out of understanding what our operations are on a sort of a stable year over year basis, it's harder to do that kind of analysis, but it's something we'd like to think about for the future.
Thanks, Noah. So since the consultation is ending on April 25th, is the reporting for Blue Box, ITT, and batteries still due April 30th, or is it being delayed?
No, it won't be due April 30th. It will be put off. The exact timing for reporting will get communicated to you as soon as we know it. For Blue Box and HSP, it will likely be later this year in the fall. And that's because we very much want Blue Box and HSP producers to be able to report through the registry portal rather than through the sort of the spreadsheet and email approach we used last year and are still using as reports come in. And that's because it's much more efficient for us to have producers come through the portal. It's very effort intensive to do that manual spreadsheet by spreadsheet approach. And so it'll be a lot easier for us and for producers to do it through the portal, which is being developed now, will be hopefully live in the fall. So Blue Box and HSP producers will likely be reporting then. Tires, ITT, AV, and batteries producers will be sooner than that, in late spring or early summer. The exact timing is still being decided on, but as soon as we know it, you will get a communication about those deadlines in advance. Probably multiple communications.
Great. This is to clarify a previous question. Can we share the RRCEA budget broken down by program? So how much of the 12.81 million is allocated to tires?
So that is in, that question might have been asked before we got to the slide. That is in the presentation. It might not be in the materials that are posted online right now, but that is in today's presentation and will be posted after this presentation is done.
Perfect. And there's another question here. Is the increase in the tire fee for large producers expected to be passed on to the shops and dealerships who sell tires? For example, we currently pay and charge the end user or the retail customer $4 per tire. What is this $4 made up of?
So the $4 per tire, if it's a resource recovery charge under the regulation, should be only made up of costs used, of costs that were expended to fulfill resource recovery obligations under the regulation. So that would include, or that it could include, the RRCEA fee plus the cost, the other costs of complying with the regulation, which is the bulk of that would be the obligation to collect and manage tires at the end of their life. So if you're using that charge or seeing that charge, the biggest component would be the cost to collect and manage the tires when they're used up. But RRCEA's fee could be part of that fee as well.
Okay, next question. Small weights can have large profits. Judging ability to pay by weight on the market is the reason why other jurisdictions have a flat fee for registration. So why was Optimus chosen?
So Optimus was chosen through a open competitive procurement that we ran in the fall. And they were the selected vendor from the applicants that responded to the request for proposals. So when we are looking at our fee model by weight, I think ability to pay is one of the factors that we look at. part of the analysis for RRCEA is also what information do we have available from our producers that's reliable. And so supply weights are required to be reported to us under the regulation. We do compliance work around them to make sure they're correct. Those should be reliable reports and something that we can use to fulfill our equity principles, simplicity principles, and trying to support the objectives of the regulation.
Okay, and then we have a question related to lighting. Why is lighting being separated out from the fee rates under the EEE regulation for ITT and AV? ITT, AV, and batteries started at different times and are separate regulations, but have been grouped together, while lighting is under the same regulation as ITT, AV, and it has been separated out. Do you have a bit more clarification for that, Noah?
Sure. I mean, we really see lighting as a different program. It's on a different timeline. Obviously, the fee setting for lighting is on a different path because the registration is happening 2 years after ITT, AV, and batteries registration. When we were setting fees for ITT, AV, and batteries, they were on the same registration timeline from an operational perspective, the same startup timeline. There were overlaps in producers and in the regs in terms of how electronics and batteries were being regulated. So we have grouped those two together, but the same reasons don't apply to lighting. And so we're treating lighting as its own program with its own cost recovery target.
Thanks, Noah. We have one last question in the queue here. Wouldn't it be easier for RPRA to just charge the fees to pros instead of producers? This way it could be simply incorporated into the eco fees paid by producers.
So that's an interesting suggestion. A big part of the reason we charge fees to producers is because producers are the one with the key responsibility under the regulations, not the pros. And the producers are the ones who are obligated to report to us their supply. So we get performance information from the pros with respect to their producer clients. But nothing obligates the pros to share their clients' supply data with us. So we don't have an easy way to apply our fee model to the pros, given how the regulations are set up. So I think that's probably the one of the key reasons why we have a fee focused on producers. I guess the other one, other key reason is that even though most producers rely on pros to fulfill their obligations under the regulations, they aren't obligated to. We can't, RRCEA can't force a producer to work with a pro. That's the producer's choice. And there are avenues for producers to be able to work outside of the pro system to fulfill their requirements. And so because pros aren't mandatory, it's kind of another reason why we focused on producers.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Noah. That brings us to the end of all our questions. So we're just going to take a quick pause here before we finish off our webinar. This will only take a few minutes of everyone's time, and we do this in all of our sessions to help us learn and gain feedback from our stakeholders and potentially improve our webinars and other sessions going forward. So I'll be launching a poll, and if you could please take a few minutes to answer 4 short questions, that would be greatly appreciated. So it should be up now. And I'll just leave it up for a few minutes. Okay, I think we'll be closing it about now. Perfect. I'll just show you the quick results. Thank you. Okay, now over to you on the last steps.
Sure. So again, this is a consultation. I tried my best to answer your questions during this presentation. If you have more questions or you didn't like my answers, which is totally fine, we're still interested in hearing your feedback. The earlier you can get us your feedback, the better. So I know we're open until April 25th, but the earlier we can hear additional details from you about what you think of the proposal, the easier it will be for us to kind of respond to you and address your comments. But we are open till April 25th. You can email us at consultations@rrcea, again, with questions or comments in writing. Final fees will get posted to our website. You will get notified in different ways when they're set. For lots of producers, you'll get notified in particular when it's time for you to come in and register with us. And as we talked about earlier, that's a different timeline for each of the programs. All of the feedback from our consultation will get summarized in a report that you'll see on our website when the consultation period is done. That also goes to our board as one of the inputs into their decision on setting final fees.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Just a reminder that the session is being recorded and will be available on our website along with the presentation slides. We thank everyone for taking the time out of your day to join us on this webinar, and have a great day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.